Welcome back tonight. Did not really mean equal. The 1950s would prove to be the launching point for some of the moments and people who remain iconic to this day. Well, 13 Action News is committed to continuing the conversation about race in our country. And tonight, reporter Alicia Patillo shows you some of the defining events of the civil rights movement.
This train would be carrying nothing but freedom. There would be no segregation. So we're going to tell them, and we're going to tell them loud, that the freedom train is coming and it's carrying nothing but freedom. Yeah. Carrying nothing but freedom, freedom.
We've got some difficult days ahead, but it really doesn't matter with me now. Because I've been to the mountaintop. I don't mind.
The movement is not a single act or a single person, but rather a series of events that would propel Black activism into the world's consciousness.
The way that I think one can explain all of this is that nothing necessarily is occurring in isolation, that there's a broader movement that can be undertaken. Simultaneously, there's a young preacher named Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. who is going throughout the South and also asserting and indicting the United States broadly for the way in which African Americans are being treated at that time.
Like anybody, I would like to live a long life. Longevity has its place. But I'm not concerned about that now. I just want to do God's will.
Two policemen came on the bus, and one asked me if the driver had told me to stand, and I said yes.
On December 1st, 1955, 5 months after the brutal death of 14-year-old Emmett Till, a Black woman was arrested because she refused to give up her seat to a white man on a bus in Alabama. Her name was Rosa Parks, and that single act of defiance would spark the Montgomery bus boycott.
There was a concept that even Martin Luther King Jr. talked about called the new Negro. And this idea was essentially that this new generation of Black Americans would no longer tolerate the segregation or the racist policies that their ancestors, were born with and had to deal with.
This period was known as the Civil Rights Movement, a time when many Black people in America decided they would no longer suffer silently.
The new Negro is a person with a new sense of dignity and destiny, with a new self-respect.
Although Brown versus the Board of Education made it illegal to have segregated schools, many cities ignored the Supreme Court's ruling, and many schools across the U.S. remained white only until something monumental happened in Arkansas. In September of 1957, despite the Supreme Court ruling 3 years earlier, 9 Black students known as the Little Rock Nine were blocked from integrating into a high school in Little Rock, Arkansas. What happened next changed the history of the U.S. and the history of my family, as one of those brave students is my cousin. On September 4th, 1957, the students showed up to class and were harassed by angry mobs. It took the power of the president to get them into the classroom that day. President Dwight D. Eisenhower had to send in federal troops to escort the students inside.
The history of America is one in which Black trauma is what leads to social change, and the calls for justice and social change are what, unfortunately, motivate the broader American public to pay attention.
Days after the incident in Little Rock, a major change would take place in Washington, D.C. On September 9th, 1957, President Eisenhower signed the Civil Rights Act of 1957, a law that would protect African Americans when voting, making it illegal to interfere or suppress the Black vote. Despite that legislation and the laws that came before it, change was still needed because many of those laws were being ignored. In the months and years to come, Black people would organize several demonstrations, marches, and protests to end racial discrimination and bolster the unprecedented fight for equality. The revolution had begun.
Civil rights protesters also knew that they had to get many of these images distributed. They had to ensure that the press was paying attention. And one could argue Mamie Till was the one who was innovating all of this.
Civil rights movement really didn't catch a fire until the nation saw fire hoses and the dogs being sicked on folks. America saw what was going on.
A long time coming, but I know a change gonna come.
We must not approach the observance and enforcement of this law in a vengeful spirit. Its purpose is not to punish. Its purpose is not to divide, but to end divisions.
The movement led to one of the greatest achievements for Black culture. Through blood, sweat, and tears came the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the legislation that outlawed discrimination based on race, color, religion, or sex in public places and employment. Equality was the law of the land, but the celebration didn't come without despair.
Our time is just about up, Minister Malcolm.
Ain't gonna let no city commissioner, Lord, turn me round, turn me round, turn me round. Ain't gonna let no city commissioner, Lord, turn me round. Keep on walking, yeah, keep on.
I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land.
Just like any other social or political revolution, there's always something that leads up to it, and there's a series of events that occur. And I think we're seeing this today. Multiple forms of police brutality, multiple cases of societal injustice are all coalescing and being brought together to the point where activists see this as the point where you have to call for social change, you have to put on the pressure, and you see that this is a moment where you can get people to join you.
A half-century after Martin Luther King was killed, his voice has become many, his cause still current.
So I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
As the movement presses on again. Alicia Patillo, 13 Action News.
Welcome back. Here's a look at tonight's ABC Primetime lineup. It gets started at 8 o'clock with Modern Family at 9. Black